cloud. Thank you, Zoom. Sam Kriegman. Sam Kriegman joins us from Boston. He's a computer scientist with a joint postdoctoral appointment at Harvard and at the Allen Discovery Center at Tufts University. He's the co-creator of the world's first computer-designed organisms, Xenobots, and a co-developer of some truly intriguing new kinds of robot kits. That's it. Everything else, you go to lasertalks.com, you can find out more about Sam. Okay, I ask you to unmute yourself, and the podium is yours.
Thank you. Okay, can everyone see my screen? You should see computer designed organisms and my name.
Yes.
Okay, great. So hello, thanks for inviting me. Good evening. It is 9 p.m. here on the East Coast, but I am awake and excited to tell you about computer designed organisms. My name is Sam Kriegman, and I have a joint postdoctoral appointment with the Wyss Institute at Harvard and the Allen Discovery Center at Tufts University. And in this talk, I will describe how computers can be used to create new kinds of organisms, which are known in popular culture as Xenobots or Xenobots, depending on your pronunciation, as well as a few other names. You can call them whatever you like. For the purposes of this talk, I chose computer designed organisms. We'll start with a little bit of inspiration. We are surrounded every day by incredible machines. Animals, plants, bacteria, cells. They're self-powered, self-driving, self-repairing, self-replicating, intricate, complex, the list goes on. They are amazing systems that support and enrich our lives. We're also surrounded by the useful technologies we've built to date. They also support and enrich our lives. They are amazing. They've surpassed animals in certain areas. No animal can fly to the moon and back. No plant can grow into outer space, but our technologies have important, sometimes subtle, sometimes glaringly obvious limitations. If you take your cell phone out of your pocket and you throw it across the room, it will break, obviously. If you drop it in the toilet, it will also break. If you hit it with a hammer, sooner or later, our tech, it becomes trash and it ends up in a landfill or in the ocean where it degrades over time and can produce harmful ecological and health side effects. So it would thus be useful if we could build technologies out of materials that are self-renewing, biodegradable, and biocompatible. The best candidates for such materials are living systems themselves. So let's do it. Let's build an artificial system out of cells, which are, after all, the building blocks of life. We'll start really simple with a Lego brick made of skin cells. And I'll introduce just one other kind of Lego brick, heart muscle, red when contracting and green when expanding in volume. Now, these cells come from the African clawed frog, whose name is Xenopus laevis, hence the name Xenobots. They come from one-day-old eggs of this frog, and I'll explain that process in a moment, but that's it. That's your Lego kit. Say you have 1,000 of each of these two block types. What would you build? What could you build? And what could those systems even do? To find out, I created a computer simulation and I asked the computer to generate millions of random designs. Here's 3 of them. 3 randomly generated configurations of our 2 building blocks, skin cells and heart muscle tissue. None of these 3 randomly designed systems fully satisfy our objective, which is to move into the right-hand side of the screen. But as you can see, the design in the top left doesn't move at all, while some designs, like the design in the middle row, leans over in the right direction by chance, slightly. So we can delete the bad designs and replace them with modified copies of the better designs, and repeat this process again and again and again. And that's the formula for evolution. So after a while, we get simulated agents capable of crawling locomotion. So here are 5 diverse designs, different arrangements of simulated frog skin cells in blue and simulated frog heart cells in red. And each of these designs is predicted by the computer to be capable of forward locomotion, of crawling. And here's what those designs look like when they're built out of real frog skin cells and real frog heart cells. Let's focus on this one particular design. It has muscle on the bottom and 2 leg-like stumps. It's much easier to see if we inject the different cell types with this RNA molecule that makes it glow green for skin and red for heart. And as you can see, the morphology transferred, the anatomy, the shape and distribution of these different tissue types, it transferred pretty well from simulation to reality. But more important is whether or not the behavior transfers from simulation to reality. And as you can see on the bottom of the screen, the behavior of the simulated robot or agent on the left matches that of its living counterpart on the right. So let's pause for a moment and think about what this means. It shows that AI can not only design new proteins, as in the case of DeepMind's AlphaFold and other biological building blocks, not just that, but AI can design whole new kinds of organisms that look and act completely differently from any other organism that has ever existed on Earth. I've never seen any animal that has 2 legs and muscle on the bottom and scoots along the bottom of a petri dish before. And this is, of course, just one design. The space of possible multicellular life forms is vast with a capital V, and navigating the space efficiently is an unsolved open problem in computer science and evolutionary biology. We do not know how to do it yet. To make a computer-designed organism, we start with 1-day-old frog eggs. We remove chunks of tissue from specific regions of this frog egg. At this point in development, the stem cells inside of the egg are mostly undifferentiated. They can become anything in the frog, but their position in the egg indicates their fate. So we know where to cut to get skin and heart. We dissociate the white stem cells from the outer brown shell of the egg. And what we're left with are these white spherical stem cells. And these are Lego bricks with which we can make a computer-designed organism. If you bring enough of these white stem cells into contact with each other, they stick together, they compact, and they form a sphere. That's because these cells, they expect to be surrounded by neighbors in the developing animal. So when they notice that they're on the surface, they try to heal. They try to minimize surface area, and the result is forming a sphere. Now with this sphere, we can then pretend to be artists for a little bit, or sculptors, and we can carve out the shape by subtraction using very small, very sharp forceps. This ball is about 1 millimeter, less than 1 millimeter across. So it's visible to the naked eye, but it's about the size of a poppy seed. And we're performing surgery on this poppy seed with a microcautery device in the beginning of the video that slightly burns the tissue so that it holds its shape, and here 2 very sharp forceps. Some finishing touches are applied to the 3D morphology, which if you look very closely, you can see it's a tetrapod with 4 little limbs. So the resulting animal is self-powered. Each cell comes preloaded with fat and protein stores, not unlike the yolk of a chicken egg, which it burns for energy over the course of 2 weeks, and then it simply biodegrades. Another really nice property of technologies that are made of living tissues is that when we damage them by cutting out a very large chunk in the side of its body, it simply zippers its body right back up like nothing happened. So recall and contrast the iPhone that was smashed. I think it would be pretty nice if our technologies could repair themselves like living systems do. So we'd really like to know how do living systems self-repair and why my iPhone and laptop and car cannot fix themselves. Well, self-repair is easy for these living systems because each cell inside of the organism is itself an immensely complex, intelligent machine. And within cells are intelligent organelles, and within organelles are intelligent molecular machines. In other words, living systems are intelligent machines made of intelligent machines made of intelligent machines. It's intelligence all the way down. And this nested competency is very different from my iPhone, for instance. The parts of my phone are not intelligent. They're useless alone. Alas, this is not that novel, I suppose, of an idea. Leibniz 300 years ago said some things along the same lines. A machine made by the skill of man is not a machine in each of its parts, but the machines of nature, namely living bodies, are still machines in their smallest parts ad infinitum. It is this that constitutes the difference between nature and art, that is to say, between the divine art and ours. In other words, living bodies are resilient because it is very unlikely that all levels of their organization will be surprised at once. At the level of the organism, a big gash in the side of its bodies is very surprising, but from the cells and tissues perspective, they've seen this before. They know what to do. They've seen this during development, just as you saw when they were compacting into a sphere. They know how to heal and zipper themselves right back up. Aha, but there's an even better way to preserve oneself and one's behavior over long periods of time. What is it? Any guesses? What's the ultimate form of self-repair?
Reproduction.
Yep. I was going to give you a hint. If you have one rabbit or at least two rabbits, you end up, they don't just fix small cuts and bruises, they proliferate. So of course, the answer is self-replication or reproduction. This raises the question, can we create self-replicating technologies? That is, technologies that increase in numbers exponentially over time, like a pair of rabbits. If replication occurs faster than the rate at which those machines break down, they would also be capable of what's known as exponential utility or usefulness. I've always found this subject interesting and very important to explore, so I pushed a little bit along these lines with my team here at Tufts and Harvard and the University of Vermont. And of course, we weren't alone. Here's a figure from a NASA report 40 years ago that depicts a robot arm. It's grabbing robot components from a shelf behind it. It's bringing those components over its body and it's assembling a copy of itself in front of it. And once it's done assembling a copy, it continues to reach for parts behind it, pass those parts forward, and the rightmost robot in this chain keeps on building another copy. Now, you might be asking yourself, why on earth would we want machines to self-replicate? What's wrong with factories and automated assembly lines? Let's just go through some economics for a little bit. Existing factories are capable of what's known as constant or linearly increasing usefulness or utility. For example, a factory makes 3 cars per unit of time. The next unit of time, we have 6 cars and 9 cars and so on. So after some initial investment required to build the factory, the output is constant, and utility, the amount of useful work, increases linearly plus or minus some variation over time. So what would an exponential technology look like? Well, suppose a factory not only makes cars or something useful, but it also makes a copy of itself. So time is flowing outwards in this plot. So at time 0, we have 1 factory, and at time 1 or time 2, we have darker factories, darker cars. The number of factories has doubled to 2. We have 2 factories producing cars, and we have 4 factories, 12 units, 12 cars per units of time. Then at the next time step, we have 24 cars per unit of time, and so on. Okay, in the age of COVID, we are all too familiar with exponential curves, I know, but what if the height of that curve was something good? There are ethical and safety considerations, of course, but there's also infinite potential. And more importantly, there are already self-replicating problems we face due to lack of knowledge. COVID is just one example. Now, self-replication is a fundamental property of life, so therefore, I believe we should seek to better understand it, predict it, and control it to support our needs. Now, I mentioned these computer-designed organisms are called Xenobots, and when I described the Xenobots as organisms, one of the most common refrains that I heard was that, no, Xenobots are not organisms because they cannot reproduce. Well, I guess we heard that and we said challenge accepted. But before I explain how we got these computer-designed organisms to reproduce, I need to show you one other motor. And this motor is called cilia. And cilia are very small patches of hair. This orange glowing object in the center is a ciliated xenobot. These small patches of orange glowing hair act like flexible oars. They whip against the water and propel this organism forward. These cilia hairs are found on the skin of frogs, and they're used just to swish mucus around and keep the frog nice and slimy, and they're repurposed here as tiny motors. Cilia is also found in every organ in our body, and when something goes wrong with cilia, it's called ciliopathy. Understanding cilia, even if using it to build a silly robot, I think is a worthwhile endeavor. So what do? We placed a dozen of these ciliated xenobots in a dish amongst loose white stem cells. The xenobots swim around, and they did something interesting. They pushed the stem cells into piles. You might see where this is going, given the background of the NASA cartoon and the rabbits. Piles containing at least 50 cells developed into ciliated swimming xenobot children. So just like the cartoon from the NASA report, these biological agents are assembling copies through movement instead of growth, which is how all other animals and plants reproduce. So just like that, inspired by robotics, we discovered a previously unknown form of biological replication. And when we placed the xenobot children into a new dish, they acted just like their parents. They pushed loose cells into piles that sometimes developed into grandchildren. But that's as far as we got. The grandchildren were too small and weak to create great-grandchildren. Sorry, one great-grandchildren. So I created a simulation with pink little swimming xenobots and green adhesive stem cells. I don't know how well the video is coming over, but the simulation was used to try to find xenobot parent shapes that extend the number of replication cycles before the system stops replicating. The best design was a semi-torus. We called it the Pac-Man because it resembled the 1980s arcade video game character. The Pac-Man shape seems quite simple, but it's very good. When these AI designed Pac-Man shapes were built, they replicated more often. They achieved many more rounds of replication than the default spherical parents. And the behavior of this Pac-Man shape was nicely predicted in the simulation, despite not knowing exactly how these cilia motors were going to beat or polarize or sync together. So it's a very nice instance of designing a new creature and a new form of replication and amplify that replicative process using computers. So here's a picture of these wild type xenobot parents, and they produced children who sometimes under the best known conditions produce grandchildren. That's Generation 1 is the children, generation 2 is grandchildren, and then the system stopped. And here are those AI designed Pac-Man shapes. And they created children, which created grandchildren, which created great-grandchildren, which created great-great-grandchildren, and then the whole experiment just stopped. So the AI designed parents, they produced twice as many rounds of replication compared to the wild type sphere parents, but both shapes produce spherical offspring. So it's more like the computer is designing how to hit this first domino that is falling and setting off a chain reaction of self-replication. Although we're working on ways so that these creatures can transfer their shape as well as the piling behavior. So in the past few slides, we were interested in measuring how similar organisms were to their parents. So we isolated them from each other. But if you leave the offspring in the dish with their parents, they can work together. I don't know, on my screen, the video looks like it's lagging, but essentially what's going on here is the number of pink little creatures is increasing exponentially in time. And if these robots could also carry out useful work in addition to replicating, then they might be capable of exponential utility. So I'd just like to pose the question, what would it mean if we could create exponential technologies? What previously impossible large-scale science and engineering projects could become a reality? And whether they're walking or swimming or self-replicating, these creatures challenge our previously clear distinctions between robot and organism, between production and reproduction, between machine and life. And of course, this can get a little bit uncomfortable because it erodes what makes us feel so special as humans. But it also deepens our understanding of nature and ourselves. And this knowledge will ultimately, eventually, hopefully, become embodied in useful technologies that enrich and support human lives and the biosphere. Thank you.
Great, breathtaking. These things are always science fiction. So first of all, I forgot to mention, of course, for those who didn't see it, last month, Josh Bongard gave a presentation on the same topic that was also leading into Sam's presentation. Now, Sam, now your paper, the paper came out in December, I believe, Kinematic Self-Replication, in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So if anybody wants to know more, the paper is not too difficult to understand up to a point. One question I have is about the role of AI. I mean, if I understand correctly, the artificial intelligence algorithm did two things. One, it came up with the Pac-Man-like shape. And two, it's the AI algorithm that discovered this new form of replication. Am I correct?
Yes, so in the replication studies, the role of AI was to harness this discovery. This was a discovery that we made of a new form, what we believe is a new form of replication or reproduction. This is a scientific discovery. It's more like natural history. We're kind of just watching the cells do what they do under certain circumstances. But that phenomenon was kind of ephemeral. It didn't last very long. So we asked the AI how we could extend this interesting but short-lived phenomenon. And the AI amplified this process by coming up with this Pac-Man shape. And the Pac-Man shape seems very simple. People have asked, well, I could have designed that. What you normally get when you get computers to design things for you is either rediscover something you already knew, like a wheel is a good design, or it comes up with something way simpler than a human engineer would come up with. Human engineers like to complexify things. So the Pac-Man shape was this elegant, simple design, and its purpose was to elongate, extend this interesting replication phenomenon.
Can you say a little more about the AI algorithm that you used?
Yes, so we used the simplest possible algorithm. It's called an evolutionary algorithm. You can write it down in about 3 lines of code, which is why it's so beautiful and elegant and simple. And it's basically just, once you have the simulation in place, you say, give me a bunch of random designs. This is a population of random designs. You test their fitness, how well they perform some task in the simulator. You delete the bad ones and you replace them with randomly modified copies of the better ones, rinse and repeat. And you let that run for as long as you want. And you come back, and unless something went terribly wrong or you're trying to make the system do something too complex, it normally ends up working, and you get systems that are better at whatever behavior you ask the system to perform.
Actually, see, somebody asked a similar question. Lucas asked, what tools, frameworks do you use to create the simulations? What's the software environment for the in silico experiments?
Sure. We use a simulation that was originally developed at Cornell by Hod Lipson's lab called VoxCAD. It's called Vox because these little blocks are known as voxels. They're 3D or volumetric pixels. So everything uses these voxels. We took VoxCAD and we put it on GPUs, which were originally made for gaming, but they allow for this highly parallelized, really fast computing. And we made what we call VoxCraft, which is just this GPU accelerated version of VoxCAD. I can share some websites and some resources if you're interested in getting started with it.
Yeah, sure. I think if you put them in the chat, a few of us will be interested. Before you do that, let me ask you one more question. So first generation of Xenobots, by the way, Xenos, who came up with the name? Xenos in Greek means alien, foreigner, right? Xenophobia.
I think that's, except for xenophobia, it's a nice name because they're kind of strange robots. But the reason we were always calling them Xenobots or Xenobots internally because they come from this African clawed frog whose Latin name is, or Greek name, his scientific name is Xenopus laevis, which means strange foot, smooth skin, I think. Okay. It has a claw, so it's a strange foot. We did not call them that. Yeah.
First generation was just the fact that you managed to build them. Second generation, they are capable of replicating. What's going to be the third generation?
I don't know. Maybe we'll find out tonight. We need inspiration from other kinds of minds. So this is the reason why we're able to figure this out, is because roboticists collaborated with biologists. So we applied robotics knowledge, an old idea in robotics, to biology and discovered a new form of self-replication. So I don't know what we'll discover when artists and all kinds of other thinkers join to create the fourth or third generation of Xenobots.
Okay, there's another question from the audience. Jorge is asking how video games can work with Xenobots.
Yeah, so the simulation is a lot like a video game. And this work has been done previously by Carl Sims in the early 90s, where he evolved virtual creatures in simulation. That was a big inspiration for this work. And we just took it one tiny step further by bringing these virtual video game creatures to life. So the video game aspect, what's important about that is that it captures the right aspects of reality so that we can actually bring these systems to life and build them out of real tissue, which tends to be squishy. So there's certain things that you might need to simulate that in some video games they don't necessarily have.
And my final question is, how do these organisms, how does natural selection or unnatural selection, as somebody called it, how does it relate to this organism?
I think it's an excellent question. There is natural selection inside of the computer. So unlike every other organism that's ever existed, these Xenobots, they evolved inside of a computer with natural selection happening digitally instead of physically on Earth. But now that they can self-replicate to some extent, it's possible that that system might also in the future be capable of natural selection. It's happening all inside of a petri dish, so it's a safe system. It's also very slow. We can also take away their building materials to stop them from replicating. So it seems like a safe and interesting platform to study self-replicating systems. So we're excited about that.
Excellent. Okay, I think as a teaser, it couldn't be more teasing. So very curious to see where this goes. Thank you very much, Sen.